The Voss Archive. On a Tuesday evening in April of 1994, a 67-year-old woman named Eleanor Voss drove her rusted 1981 Ford pickup down a county road that had been cracking at the edges since before she could remember, and she drove it the way she did everything else in her life, without hurry, without apology, and with both hands on the wheel. The drive from her farm on Route 9 to the Harlan County Courthouse took exactly 19 minutes. She had made this drive hundreds of times over the decades for town meetings, for auctions, for the occasional Wednesday bingo game she and Howard used to attend before Howard's knees gave out. She knew every pothole, every curve, every farmhouse light that blinked through the tree line in the dark. Tonight the drive felt different. She was wearing her good dress, not her church dress which she saved for funerals and Easter, but the dark blue one she wore to things that required what Howard used to call a certain dignity. The dress was pressed, her silver hair was pinned back. She had even put on the small pearl earrings that had been sitting in a velvet box on her dresser since Christmas. She had not dressed up because she thought it would help. She had dressed up because Howard had always told her, when they come to judge you by what they can see, show them the best version of what they're looking at, then let the truth do the rest of the work. Howard had been gone for 8 years, but she still heard his voice in moments like this, clear as a radio signal patient and precise the way he always sounded when he was absolutely certain he was right. She parked in the lot behind the courthouse and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, she could see the lights in the second-floor windows of the council chamber. Shadows moved behind the glass. The room was already filling up. She knew why she had been summoned. The notice had arrived 2 weeks ago, a formal letter from the Harlan County Agricultural Improvement Association requesting that the county council take action against what they described as an unsanitary and hazardous accumulation of agricultural waste at the property owned by Eleanor Voss on Route 9. The letter used phrases like property value deterioration and community image standards. It was signed by Ryan Caldwell, president of the association. Eleanor had read the letter twice, folded it neatly along its original creases, and placed it in the drawer where she kept important documents. Then she had gone out to the barn and stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at what she and Howard had built. She had not been angry. She had been something else entirely. Something quieter than anger and far more patient. She got out of the truck and walked into the courthouse. To understand what happened at that meeting and everything that came after it, you have to understand Eleanor Voss. Not just who she was in 1994, but who she had been building herself into for the better part of 40 years. Howard Voss had come to Harlan County in 1951, a 26-year-old veteran from central Iowa, with 320 acres, a 1948 John Deere Model A, and a piece of advice his father had given him the week before he shipped out for Korea. His father, a man named Walter Voss, who had farmed the same ground in Iowa for 30 years, had sat him down on the porch and said something Howard would spend the rest of his life proving was true. Parts are money, every bolt, every bearing, every gear. That's money you won't have to spend later. The dealers will always tell you to buy new. Don't listen. Keep everything. Fix what you can. Someday you'll be glad you did. Howard had married Eleanor in 1953. She was 26, then a schoolteacher's daughter from just outside of Kearney, who had grown up reading in the evenings and helping her father repair fences on weekends. She was not the kind of woman that people in 1953 expected to be interested in hydraulic systems or bearing tolerances or the internal mechanics of a grain auger. But she was curious about everything Howard touched, and Howard had always believed that curiosity was the most important thing a person could possess. In those early years, she would sit on an overturned bucket in the barn and watch him work, asking questions. What does that part do? What happens when it fails? Why this one instead of that one? Howard would explain as he worked, patient and thorough, treating her questions as seriously as if she were an engineering student rather than his wife. Over time, she stopped just watching. She started helping. And over more time, the distinction between the two of them inside that barn became difficult to see at all. The philosophy was Howard's. The execution increasingly was both of theirs. Every machine that broke on the Voss farm was disassembled before it was discarded. Every worn component was clean labeled and shelved. Howard built the shelving system himself from rough-cut lumber, working through winter evenings with a lantern and a notebook, where he sketched the layout and kept running lists of what they had and what they needed. When neighbors upgraded their equipment and hauled old machines to the scrapyard, Howard would show up with the truck and make an offer. $50 for a seized combine, $20 for a tractor that hadn't run in a decade. The neighbors shook their heads and said, "Howard, that's just junk." Howard would say parts and load it up and drive home, and Eleanor would help him unload it, and they would spend the next 3 evenings disassembling it piece by piece. By the time the 1970s arrived, the barn had become something extraordinary. Not visually extraordinary. Visually, it looked like a man had simply decided to store chaos indoors. But to Howard and Eleanor, it was a system, a library, a living document of 40 years of agricultural history written in steel and iron and rubber. The neighbors saw mess. Howard and Eleanor saw inventory. Howard died in the spring of 1986, a heart attack quick and without warning on a Tuesday morning in the South Field. He was 61 years old. Eleanor had found him there in the grass between 2 rows of winter wheat that was coming in green and strong, and she had sat beside him for a while before she went inside to make the call. She did not fall apart. That was not who she was. She grieved quietly in private in the way of a woman who had learned that the most important things in life rarely announce themselves loudly. But the barn was the thing she had to decide about. She could have sold it all. There were dealers who would have paid for the whole collection by the pound. Scrappers who would have loaded it onto flatbeds within a week. She had received 3 such calls in the month after Howard's funeral, offers delivered in the gentle apologetic tone of men who assumed she wouldn't want to deal with it. She had turned them all down. She turned them down because the barn was not junk. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. She turned them down because Howard had built something real inside those walls, something that had practical weight in the world, and the fact that nobody else could see it clearly was their problem, not hers. And she turned them down because of what she had found 2 weeks after the funeral in the bottom drawer of Howard's desk in the farmhouse office. It was a notebook. Brown leather, the kind you could buy at the hardware store in town. The cover was worn at the corners from years of handling. Inside, in Howard's careful, deliberate handwriting, were 37 pages of observations, calculations, and predictions written between 1979 and 1981. Eleanor sat at the desk and read every word. Howard had been thinking in those years about something that most people in 1981 would have considered an impossible scenario. He had been thinking about what would happen to American agriculture if the supply chain failed. Not a small disruption, a real one. The kind where the trucks stop running and the dealers empty out and the parts that every farm depends on simply stop appearing. He had tracked the labor disputes in the trucking industry through newspaper articles he had clipped and taped into the notebook. He had interviewed 3 local dealers off the record about their inventory buffers and learned that most of them carried less than 30 days of stock on the most critical components. He had talked to an old friend in the distribution business in Omaha who told him privately that the entire system was built on assumptions of uninterrupted flow and that those assumptions had never actually been tested at scale. And on the final page of the notebook, Howard had written this: "Supply chains will fail. I don't know when. Could be a drought, could be a strike, could be something nobody's thought of yet. But they will fail. And when they do, the person with parts is the person who survives. Not just survives, the person who can hold the whole county together while everyone else is standing around wondering what happened. That's why we keep everything. That's always been why." Eleanor had read that page 3 times the night she found it. Then she had closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and gone to bed. She did not go to bed because she needed to think about what to do. She went to bed because she already knew. She had always known on some level, though. Seeing it written in Howard's handwriting made it concrete in a way it hadn't been before. She was going to finish what he started. For 8 years after Howard's death, Eleanor Voss ran the farm and maintained the barn with a discipline that would have made Howard proud and probably surprised him a little. She hired a part-time hand named Bobby Getty, a quiet man in his 50s who knew machinery and kept his opinions to himself to help with the fieldwork. But the barn was hers alone. She spent 3 evenings a week inside it, continuing in the system Howard had built, expanding it, refining it, adding the parts she acquired from farms that had been sold off or consolidated, or simply abandoned by families who had finally run out of the will to keep going. She also kept the notebook. Not just kept it, she updated it. On the inside back cover, Howard had left several blank pages. Eleanor began writing in those pages in the fall of 1986 in her own hand, in the small and precise cursive she had learned from her father. She tracked the changes she saw in the agricultural supply system year by year, the dealer consolidations, the shift toward just-in-time inventory, the labor tensions in the trucking industry that ebbed and flared and never quite went away. She had no formal training in economics or logistics, but she had 40 years of practical observation and a husband who had taught her to pay attention to the thing behind the thing. By 1993, she had filled those back pages and started a second notebook. In February of 1994, she had read a trade industry bulletin about contract negotiations between the Teamsters and several major trucking companies. The negotiations were described as tense. The word impasse appeared twice in the article. Eleanor had read that article, set it on the kitchen table, and gone out to the barn. She spent that whole February evening in the section she had always thought of as the critical row. The kits and components for late-model combine harvesters, the machines that the younger farmers in the county had been buying over the past several years. She took inventory. She noted what she had. She noted what she was missing. She made 3 acquisitions in March, paying for them out of her own pocket at an estate auction outside of Lexington, without telling anyone what she was doing or why. And then the letter from Ryan Caldwell arrived, and she had gone to the town meeting in her good dress. Now let me tell you about Ryan Caldwell, because you have to understand the man who brought this all to a head. Ryan was 40 years old in 1994, the oldest son of Frank Caldwell, who had farmed 800 acres north of the Voss place for 3 decades. Frank had been a careful, deliberate man, the kind who kept his word and remembered every favor and returned every tool he borrowed with a note of thanks attached. He had been a good neighbor to Howard Voss and a quiet but consistent presence in the county. He had died in 1989, a year of bad weather and thin margins, leaving the land to his 2 sons. Ryan had taken over immediately and completely. He was efficient, decisive, and absolutely convinced that the future of agriculture looked nothing like its past. Within 2 years of inheriting the farm, he had torn down his father's old wooden barn and replaced it with a steel building that smelled like a car dealership. He had sold off every piece of equipment Frank had owned and replaced it with new machines, a combine that cost more than most houses in the county, a tractor whose computer system required a specialist to diagnose a full line of implements still wearing their dealer decals. He had also founded the Harlan County Agricultural Improvement Association, which was in practical terms a collection of younger farmers who believed that the old ways were not just outdated but embarrassing, and that Harlan County would never attract investment or development as long as it looked like it was still operating in 1952. Ryan was not a cruel man. It is important to say that clearly. He was not someone who set out to hurt people. But he was a man in a hurry, pushing against the memory of a father he had loved but found difficult to live up to. And sometimes when a man is running that fast, he doesn't look carefully at what he's running past. He had driven by Eleanor Voss's property on Route 9 dozens of times. He had seen the barn from the road, the open doors, the shelves stacked to the ceiling, visible from 50 yards away, the tractor engine hanging from the chain just inside the entrance. He had seen what everyone else saw when they drove past. He had never once stopped. He had never once walked through the door. He had looked from the outside and decided he understood what he was looking at. And that decision, made quickly and without curiosity, would cost him more than he could have imagined. The Harlan County Courthouse was a brick building from 1923 with high ceilings and wood-paneled walls and the particular smell of old paper and industrial floor wax that seems to exist in every small-town government building in America, regardless of when it was last cleaned. The council chamber was on the 2nd floor, folding chairs in rows, a raised platform for the council members, an American flag that hung without moving in the corner because there was no window to give it any reason to stir. Eleanor arrived early. She took a seat in the back row and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The room filled around her, farmers she had known for 30 years, townspeople who nodded at her in the grocery store, a few of the younger families who had moved into the county in the past decade and whose children she sometimes saw at the church picnic. Some of them nodded at her. Most did not. She noticed this without judgment. She was beyond the age where the opinions of people in folding chairs determined how she felt about herself. Ryan Caldwell came in with his brother Derek. Ryan was wearing pressed khaki trousers and a collared shirt with a small equipment company logo embroidered on the chest. Derek was quieter, 2 years younger, with the same jaw, but a more uncertain set to his shoulders. They took seats in the front row, and Ryan had a manila folder on his knee that was thick with papers and photographs. The meeting worked through its routine business: budget reports, a road maintenance dispute that had been running for months, a zoning question that nobody seemed to fully understand, but everyone had an opinion about. Then the council chairman, a retired banker named Tom Briggs, who had been running these meetings for 11 years and had the patient, slightly weary expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what his neighbors were capable of, cleared his throat and looked down at his agenda. Next item, he said: complaint filed by the Harlan County Agricultural Improvement Association regarding property conditions at the Voss Farm on Route 9. Ryan, would you like to present? Ryan Caldwell stood and walked to the podium the way a man walks somewhere he has already rehearsed. He opened the manila folder and drew out a stack of photographs printed on good paper and held the first one up for the room to see. Thank you, Chairman Briggs. Council members, neighbors. He paused the way a man pauses when he wants to seem reluctant about something he isn't reluctant about at all. I appreciate you giving this issue your attention tonight. The first photograph showed the front of Eleanor's barn from the road. The open doors, the visible shelving, the tractor engine on the chain. A murmur went through the room. Ryan held up a second photograph. This is the north wall of the structure. As you can see, storage has expanded beyond the building itself. Parts on pallets, parts under tarps, parts stored directly on the ground without any protective covering. A third photograph. This was taken through the window. You can see that the interior aisles are barely navigable. This is a fire risk, a safety issue. And frankly, it is exactly the kind of image that makes it difficult for us to present this county as a modern agricultural community when people are considering whether to invest here. He set the photographs down on the podium's edge and looked at the room. He was good at this. He had the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to and the posture of someone who had never had a serious reason to doubt himself. I've spoken with a number of our neighbors, he said, who share these concerns. Property values throughout the area are affected when a road-facing farm looks like a salvage yard. We're not trying to be unkind, but this is a widow's hoarding problem, and it's become our community's image problem. The room laughed, not cruel laughter, but not kind either. The laughter of people who agree with something and are relieved that someone else said it first. It was a specific sound, that laughter, the sound of a room deciding to let someone else carry the weight of an opinion they had already formed. Ryan let it settle and then continued. I'm asking the council to issue a formal order requiring the property to be brought into compliance with county standards within 30 days. I understand Mrs. Voss has her reasons. He glanced toward the back row where Eleanor sat, and his expression carried the particular blend of sympathy and condescension that is sometimes more cutting than open contempt. I'm sure in her mind there's a reason for all of it, but what she's doing on that property affects all of us. And I think it's time we addressed it directly. He gathered his photographs and returned to his seat. Derek put a hand briefly on his shoulder. The room murmured in general approval. Tom Briggs looked toward the back. Mrs. Voss, he said, would you like to respond? Every head in the room turned toward the back row. Eleanor Voss sat still for a moment. She did not straighten in her chair. She did not press her lips together. She simply sat as she always sat, with the composure of a woman who had watched seasons come and go long enough to understand that most storms are temporary. Then she stood. No, sir, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. I believe he's said enough for both of us. She picked up her purse from the chair beside her. She walked to the door with the unhurried stride of someone who has somewhere more important to be. She went down the stairs and out into the April night, and the door of the courthouse swung shut behind her. The room she left behind thought it had just watched someone give up. It had not. This is the part of the story that nobody in that courthouse saw. The part that happened in private, in the dark, in the hour after the meeting ended. Eleanor did not drive home. She drove to the barn. She pulled the truck around to the side entrance, the one Howard had always used when he was working late, and she went inside and turned on the work lights that hung from the rafters on their long cables. The barn filled with yellow light. Shadows moved between the shelves. The smell was what it always was: metal and oil and aged rubber and something underneath it all that she could not name, but that always felt to her like a particular kind of safety. She walked to the back of the barn to Howard's old workbench, and she sat down on the stool he had used every evening for 30 years. She opened the drawer beneath the bench and took out the notebook. Not the original one. She kept that in the desk in the farmhouse. This was the second one, the continuation, the one she had filled herself over the 8 years since Howard's death. She opened it to the last entries she had made, February 1994, the trade bulletin, the word impasse circled in pencil. Below it, her own notes in her precise cursive handwriting, 3 lines that she had written and then looked at for a long time before closing the notebook. Contract negotiations stalled. Industry sources suggest work stoppage possible by late spring. Check feeder house bearing inventory. New 9600 models are the most likely point of failure. She read those 3 lines again now in the barn at 9 o'clock at night, while the county courthouse was still emptying its folding chairs. She had known for 2 months that something was coming. She had not known the exact shape it would take. She could not have named Ryan Caldwell or his combine or the specific bearing that would fail. But she had understood the outline of the situation, the way a farmer understands the outline of a storm on the horizon. You don't need to know exactly where the rain will fall to know that you should be ready for it. She set the notebook on the bench and looked at the shelves around her. 43 years of accumulation. 43 years of Howard's vision and her own labor, and the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping faith with a philosophy that the rest of the world regarded as stubbornness at best and delusion at worst. Every bin on those shelves had a story. Every labeled part represented a decision made by Howard first and then by her to see value where others saw garbage. The man in the courthouse had called it a widow's hoarding problem. The room had laughed. Eleanor understood something in that moment, sitting alone on Howard's stool in the yellow light of the barn, that she could not have articulated easily in words, but that she felt with complete and steady certainty. The people in that room were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what they were looking at. There is a difference. Anyone can be wrong about what they see. Vision is limited by angle and distance and the particular assumptions a person brings to a moment. But seeing the actual act of looking at something and deciding what it is that is a choice. And Ryan Caldwell had made his choice from a moving truck on a county road, glancing at a barn door he had never once walked through. Eleanor picked up the notebook again. She turned to the last blank page at the back and wrote the date in the top right corner. April 12, 1994. Below it, she wrote 1 line. They will understand soon enough. She closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and turned off the lights. She drove home in the dark past fields she had known for over 40 years, past the fence lines Howard had mended, and the ditches they had cleared together after the flood of 1967, and the stand of cottonwoods at the curve of the road that she had always loved in October when they went gold. She went inside. She locked the door. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty. Because Eleanor Voss had something that the people in the courthouse folding chairs did not have. She had Howard's notebook. She had 43 years of parts cataloged and shelved and ready, and she had the particular patience of a woman who has learned that the truth does not need defending. It only needs time. The Teamsters called the strike on a Thursday morning in May. By Friday afternoon, the first trucks had stopped moving. By the following Monday, you could feel it in the county the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not through any single dramatic event, but through 100 small absences. A delivery that didn't arrive, a phone call that went unreturned, a dealer who picked up and then put you on hold and then came back on the line with a voice that had something careful and apologetic built into it before he even started talking. The John Deere dealer in Columbus, a man named Garrett, who had been selling equipment in that part of Nebraska for 22 years, told his first affected customer on May 16th that he was looking at a 2-week delay on most standard components. He told the second customer the same thing. By the end of that week, he had stopped giving timelines altogether because the timelines he was giving were already wrong by the time he gave them. The Case IH dealer in Norfolk ran out of filters belts in the most common bearing sizes within 10 days of the strike starting. He put a handwritten sign in the window that said "Check back weekly" and meant it as honest communication rather than optimism, which made it worse somehow. The implement dealer in Hastings locked his doors on the 23rd of May and taped a notice to the glass that read "Closed until supply situation resolves." No parts available. We apologize for the inconvenience. The apology did not help anyone's crops. Planting season had just ended. The long summer maintenance window was opening. This was the season when every piece of equipment on every farm got serviced, repaired, and prepared for the harvest that would determine whether the year was a good one or a year you spent trying not to think about. Machines that had limped through the spring now needed attention. Bearings that were running rough needed replacing. Hydraulic seals that were weeping needed rebuilding. Belts that were cracking at the edges needed to come off before they came apart in the field. All of it required parts, and the parts had stopped coming. Farmers in Harlan County began calling one another in the first week the way they always did when something went wrong, sharing information, pooling knowledge, trying to figure out who had what and who needed what, and whether there was a way to get from one side of a problem to the other without the piece that was missing. These were people who had grown up solving problems with what was at hand. Improvisation was not foreign to them. But improvisation requires raw material, and raw material requires supply, and the supply had stopped. By the first week of June, the conversations had a different quality to them, less problem-solving, more something that sat between anxiety and resignation, the tone of people who are beginning to understand that the thing they're dealing with is not going to resolve itself quickly. Eleanor Voss heard all of it. Gerald Paxton, her nearest neighbor, a 71-year-old widower who had farmed the land east of hers since 1958 and who made a habit of stopping by on Tuesday mornings with a thermos of coffee and no particular agenda, kept her informed of what he was hearing. Gerald was not a man who dramatized things. He reported what he knew in plain sentences and let you draw your own conclusions, which was one of the reasons Eleanor had always trusted him. The dealers are empty, he told her on the second Tuesday of June. Garrett in Columbus said he's got 114 orders he can't fill and no idea when he'll be able to. Eleanor nodded. She already knew most of this. She had been making quiet phone calls of her own, checking in with contacts she had developed over the years. A retired parts manager in Grand Island and a woman who ran an agricultural supply cooperative in central Kansas, an old friend of Howard's who still worked in distribution out of Omaha. The picture they painted was consistent and not good. She had also, in the 2 weeks since the strike began, done something that nobody in Harlan County knew about. She had spent every evening in the barn, walking the critical row, pulling specific bins, checking condition and compatibility. She had her second notebook open on Howard's workbench, adding notes in her careful hand. She was not waiting for people to come to her. She was preparing for when they did. Ryan Caldwell's combine stopped working on the morning of June 3rd. He had been running the machine through his winter wheat since 5:30 in the morning, moving in long east-west passes across the south field, while the air was still cool enough to keep the dust from being unbearable. The 1993 John Deere 9600 was the best machine he had ever operated, responsive, powerful, capable of processing grain at a rate that would have seemed impossible to farmers of his father's generation. He had paid $182,000 for it 18 months ago and had never once questioned whether the money was justified. At approximately 9:15, he heard a sound. It started as a vibration he felt in the seat before he heard it through the cab, a low, rhythmic irregularity that did not belong to the machine's normal operating signature. Then within the space of perhaps 3 seconds, it became something audible and wrong, a grinding metallic shriek from somewhere in the feeder house that climbed in pitch and intensity and ended in a lurch and a sudden silence as the automatic shutdown engaged. Ryan had the cab door open before the dust had settled around the machine. He climbed down and walked to the front of the combine and crouched beside the feeder house, and he could tell immediately from the sound and the smell of hot metal and the way the machine had died that this was not a minor problem. He put his hand near the feeder house housing and felt the heat radiating from it before he touched the metal. He went inside and called the dealer in Columbus. Garrett listened to Ryan's description of the sound and the shutdown and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Main drive bearing on the feeder house, Garrett said. The way you're describing it, it sounds like it seized and tore itself apart. That's a full replacement, Ryan. It's not something you can patch. How long to get the part? Another silence. Longer this time. I don't have it in stock. I haven't had it in stock since the strike started. I put in an emergency order to the regional warehouse 3 days ago, and I haven't heard back. How long? Garrett, honestly, 8 weeks. maybe more. Ryan stood at the kitchen window and looked out at his combine sitting in the south field stationary in the middle of a past grain, head slightly crooked, the tall Nebraska sky enormous behind it. 8 weeks. His wheat was at peak harvest window. The window for winter wheat in this part of Nebraska, the period during which you could cut it and get maximum yield and quality, was measured in days, not weeks. 8 weeks from now, what was standing in that field would be unmarketable. It would be a total loss. He called the dealer in Norfolk. They did not have the bearing. He called a dealer in Kearney. They had been out since the second week of May. He called a contact in Lincoln who sometimes dealt in used components and who told him with genuine regret in his voice that sealed bearings for late model 9,600 feeders were simply not available anywhere in the state that he knew of. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time. On the third day, Derek came over for dinner. He was the quieter of the two brothers, less certain than Ryan in his presentation, more likely to sit and think before he spoke. He had helped Ryan modernize the operation after their father died and had never fully expressed his private reservations about how thoroughly they had cleared out the old ways along with the old equipment. That was not the kind of conversation the Caldwell brothers had with each other, but it was the kind of thing Derek thought about. They ate without much talk. Ryan explained where things stood, the combine, the timeline, the field. Derek set down his fork. "You know who might have that bearing?" he said. Ryan looked at him. Derek did not say the name. He didn't need to. Ryan pushed back from the table and walked to the window. The field was visible from here a quarter-mile south, the combine sitting in it like a monument to bad timing. "Absolutely not," Ryan said. "We're going to lose the whole field. I know that." "Ryan, that's $140,000 in wheat standing out there going past its window." "I know what it is." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Then what's the alternative?" "There isn't one. That's why we're not going to her. Because if we go to her after what we said at that meeting, it's going to look like exactly what it is. A man who was wrong standing at the door of the person he was wrong about." Derek picked up his fork again and looked at his plate. After a while, he said quietly, "Isn't that what it is?" Ryan did not answer. He stood at the window for a long time after Derek left. The evening light went from gold to orange to the flat gray that precedes dark. He watched the light change on the wheat field, on the stalled combine, on the whole quiet machinery of a situation he had built for himself with his own certainty. His father had known Eleanor Voss for 30 years. Frank Caldwell had never once called her property a junkyard, had never once signed a petition or filed a complaint or stood at a podium and held up photographs for a room full of people to laugh at. Frank had called the barn the Voss Museum, half joking, and had said once at the dinner table when Ryan was young that there was probably a part in there for anything that had ever broken down in the county if you knew where to look. Ryan had thought his father was being sentimental. He was 40 years old now, standing at a kitchen window watching his harvest opportunity expire by the hour, and he was beginning to understand what sentiment sometimes really is. It is the residue of wisdom that a younger person hasn't yet suffered enough to recognize. On the fourth day, Ryan Caldwell got in his truck and drove south on Route 9. It was a 7-mile drive. He knew every foot of it. He had driven it hundreds of times. Driven past the Voss farm hundreds of times, past the barn, with its open doors and its visible shelves and the general appearance of a building that was losing an argument with its own contents. He drove slowly now. There was no particular reason to hurry toward what he was driving toward. He thought about the photographs he had held up at the county meeting. He thought about the specific phrase he had used, a widow's hoarding problem, and the way the room had responded to it. He had felt in that moment the particular satisfaction of a man who has said a difficult thing clearly and well and been validated by his audience. He had felt competent, decisive. He thought about his father sitting at the dinner table calling it the Voss Museum. He thought about his father's hands, which were the most capable hands he had ever seen on a person, and which had known how to fix almost anything that broke on the farm. Not because Frank Caldwell had been formally trained, but because Frank had paid attention for 40 years and had never thrown away a lesson. Ryan had sold his father's tools at the estate sale in 1989. He had gotten a good price for them. He pulled into Eleanor's driveway and stopped the truck. He sat for a moment with the engine running and then turned it off. The barn was right there. Open doors, the shelves visible from where he sat, the same view he had photographed and printed and carried into a courthouse in a manila folder. Eleanor Voss was standing in front of the barn. She was wearing work clothes, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots that had seen 20 Nebraska winters. She was holding a coffee mug in both hands and watching his truck with an expression that was patient and entirely unreadable. Ryan got out of the truck. He had left his equipment company cap on the seat. It had not felt right to wear it here. He walked to where she was standing. They were perhaps 10 feet apart, separated by 7 miles of bad history and something older and better than that, which neither of them had fully reckoned with yet. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Ryan," she said. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the fence line. The morning was warm and still. "I expect you've heard about my combine," Ryan said. "I heard. Main drive bearing on the feeder house." Ryan looked at her. Her knowledge of the specific failure did not surprise him the way it once might have. He was past the point where he could afford to be surprised by Eleanor Voss. "The dealer can't get me apart. Nobody can. I've called everyone I know. I know about the strike," Eleanor said. "I've been watching it for a while." He took a breath. This was the moment. There was no useful way to approach it obliquely. "I have 140 acres of wheat in that south field that is going to be unmarketable in about 10 days if I can't get that combine running. I've exhausted every option I had." He paused. "You're the only person I haven't called." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee and looked at him over the rim of the mug. "You drove past this barn every week for 2 years, she said. "What did you see?" The question landed the way she had meant it to. Ryan opened his mouth and then closed it. He had no honest answer that didn't indict him. "A mess," he said finally. He kept his eyes on hers. "I saw a mess. I decided I knew what I was looking at without ever walking through the door. And I was wrong." Eleanor regarded him for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the barn, the way you look at something you have lived with long enough that you see it differently than anyone else possibly can. She said, "Come on then. Let's see what we have." What Ryan Caldwell saw when he walked through the doors of the Voss barn was not what he had expected to see. He had expected the interior to match the exterior impression, accumulated disorder, the physical manifestation of a person who couldn't let things go. He had built a picture of it in his mind from the photographs he had taken through the window, and the picture was of chaos. What he found instead was a library. The shelves ran floor to ceiling along every wall, built from rough lumber that had darkened with age to the color of old furniture. Each shelf was labeled with handwritten tags, the original ones in Howard's handwriting, the newer ones in Eleanor's, both sets faded but legible. The labels were precise. Not just manufacturer names, but model ranges, year spans, application types. Bins of every size contained sorted components. Bearings grouped by outer diameter and load rating. Gears sorted by tooth count and pitch. Sprockets arranged by chain gauge. Bolts and fasteners in divided containers labeled by thread specification, not just by size, but by application, because a bolt that works in one context may not work in another, and Eleanor Voss understood the difference. Engines hung from chains attached to the overhead beams, each one tagged with its source machine and year. Transmissions sat on pallets with their histories written on cardboard, attached with wire. A 1952 John Deere Model A stood in the far corner, partially disassembled, but preserved with a care that made it look more like a museum exhibit than salvage. Ryan stopped walking and simply stood. He had photographed the outside of this building. He had printed those photographs on good paper and held them up for a room full of people and described what was in them. He had said the word hazard and the word eyesore, and he had used the phrase "a widow's hoarding problem," and the room had laughed, and he had felt the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who believes he has described something accurately. He had been describing the cover. He had never read the book. Eleanor moved through the barn the way water moves through a channel it has carved over decades, certain of its path, unhurried, shaped by long familiarity with every turn. She led him along the main aisle, past the combine sections, past a row she called the hydraulic wall, past a shelf labeled PTO, shafts all years, where a row of power takeoff shafts stood upright in a rack like a small regiment of steel soldiers. "Here," she said. She stopped in front of a section labeled J.D. Feeder House, late model 1985 forward. The shelf held components Ryan could see were specifically relevant to machines in the same family as his. Eleanor ran her fingers along the items, slowly reading the tags the way a reader reads a shelf of books looking for a specific title. She pulled out a sealed component and held it toward the light that came through the high window above the shelf. It was a bearing assembly, older than what he ran in his combine visibly, so the casing had the slight surface oxidation of metal that had been sitting for years, and the design was different from the sealed unit Ryan's machine used. But the mounting flanges, the shaft bore the general configuration, these were recognizable. This came off a prototype, Eleanor said. John Deere ran field trials in '87 on a design they were testing before they went to sealed units for the production run. They sent a small number of machines out to farms for evaluation and then changed direction before manufacturing. The design was never released commercially. Ryan looked at the bearing. Where did you get it? Howard bought the trial machine from a farmer in Iowa when John Deere decommissioned it. Paid $200 for it. We've been pulling components off it for 7 years. Will it fit my machine? Eleanor turned the bearing in her hands. Same mounting pattern, same shaft diameter, same load rating. The design is simpler. It's a rebuildable unit rather than sealed, which is actually an advantage if something goes wrong with it in the field. She set it on the workbench beside her. I'll need to make a small adapter plate. I have the stock for it. Give me 2 hours. Ryan stared at the bearing sitting on Howard's workbench. At the barn around him, at the 43 years of organized knowledge that lived in every labeled bin and tagged component on every shelf. He thought about the photographs in the manila folder. He thought about the room laughing. Mrs. Voss, he said. His voice came out different than he intended, lower, rougher at the edges, the way a voice sounds when the thing it's carrying is too heavy for its usual register. Why are you helping me after the meeting? After what I said. Eleanor picked up the bearing again and turned toward the workbench. She found a stool and sat down and began laying out tools with the methodical patience of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Your father helped me once, she said. She did not look up from the workbench. Summer of 1978, I was going through treatment. She paused. Cancer, breast. Howard didn't tell people, and I didn't either, but Frank knew because Howard needed to tell someone, and Frank was the kind of man you could tell things to without worrying about what he'd do with them. Ryan stood very still. I had 80 acres of corn that needed to come in, and I couldn't do it alone, and Howard was trying to be in 2 places at once and not managing either one. She set a tool down and picked up another. Frank showed up at 5 in the morning with his combine. He brought you and your brother with him. You were 24. Derek was 22. You worked all day. Every acre. Frank wouldn't take a cent. Ryan was quiet. He had a memory of that summer, vague but present, a hot day on a farm that was not his family's, the smell of cut corn, his father's voice giving directions. He had not known until this moment what the context was. Frank said neighbors help neighbors, Eleanor continued. Said someday he'd need the same, and that would make them even. She picked up the bearing and examined the mounting flange with care. Howard passed in '86, Frank in '89. Neither of them got the chance to square the account between them. She set the bearing down again and looked at Ryan directly for the first time since they had come inside. So I figure the debt passes to the next generation. Same as the land does. Ryan had been a farmer long enough to understand that kind of accounting. Obligation that moved through families the way land did, the way knowledge did, the way the shape of a man's hands sometimes appeared in his children, whether they wanted them or not. He understood it, but understanding it didn't make it easier to stand in front of. He was 40 years old, and he had spent the years since his father's death building something that he believed was better than what Frank Caldwell had built. Bigger machines, better technology, modern systems. He had swept out the old ways and installed the new ones, and he had told himself and anyone who would listen that this was progress, that this was what the county needed, that the people who held on to the past were holding everyone back. He was standing in a barn full of the past right now, watching a 67-year-old woman prepare to save his harvest with a prototype part from 1987 that she had been holding in inventory for 7 years because her husband had understood in 1981 that there would be a day exactly like this one. Go home, Ryan, she said not unkindly. Come back in 2 hours. Bring your truck and bring your tools. We'll need to run out to your field. He walked back through the library of Howard Voss's life's work and out into the June morning. He drove the 7 miles back to his farm and waited with the particular restlessness of a man who has run out of things to do except think. 2 hours later, he was back. 2 hours after that, Eleanor Voss was lying on her back on the ground under the feeder house of Ryan's combine with a wrench in her hand and a flashlight between her teeth fitting a 37-year-old adapter plate, machine from stock she kept in Howard's shop to a prototype bearing that no dealer in the country had ever stocked, while Ryan handed her tools and held the light when she needed both hands free. It took 40 minutes. She stood up. She brushed the field dirt from her canvas trousers. She told Ryan to run it at low speed first. Listen for any irregularity, give it 15 minutes before going to full operating capacity. He did exactly what she said. The combine ran. The feeder house turned. The threshing mechanism engaged. The whole breathing, churning, improbable machine that had been sitting dead in a Nebraska wheat field for 4 days came back to life in the early afternoon of June 7th, and Ryan Caldwell stood beside it in the dust and the heat and felt something shift in him that he did not have immediate words for. Eleanor was already walking back to his truck to get her toolbox. She moved without ceremony. There was no drama in her posture, no performance of having been proven right. She had fixed a machine, that was all. The machine needed fixing, and she had fixed it, and now there was other work to do. Ryan watched her and felt the shift settling into something more specific. It was not quite shame, though. Shame was part of it. It was the particular feeling a person gets when they realize they have been measuring the world with the wrong instrument. When the tool they have been using to determine what matters and what doesn't turns out to have been calibrated against nothing real. When the photographs in the manila folder, the ones they were so certain told a clear and accurate story, turn out to have been taken from entirely the wrong angle. He walked to his truck and helped Eleanor load her toolbox into the bed, and they drove back toward Route 9 without speaking much, and the wheat field opened behind them in the afternoon light, gold and full and still harvestable, still possible, still there. Word travels fast in a county where people still talk to each other. By the evening of June 7th, the same day, Eleanor Voss put Ryan Caldwell's combine back into operation. Gerald Paxton had heard the broad strokes of what had happened from a man at the co-op, who had heard it from Derek Caldwell, who had driven out to the field in the early afternoon and watched the machine running, and come away with the particular expression of a person who has just witnessed something they will be telling people about for years. Gerald stopped by Eleanor's farm the following morning with his thermos, as he did most Tuesdays, and he sat at her kitchen table and listened to her account of the previous day without interrupting, giving each piece of information the space it needed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I expect you are going to have some visitors." "I expect so," Eleanor said. "You want me to help manage the schedule?" She looked at him across the table. Gerald Paxton was not a man who offered things he didn't mean. He was 71 years old and his knees were not good, and he had his own farm to tend to, and what he was offering was his time, which was the only currency that mattered at their age. She said, "I'd appreciate that." He nodded and poured himself more coffee and pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket and uncapped a pen. "Who goes first?" he said. Eleanor thought for a moment. "Peterson," she said. "He called 2 weeks ago about his disc blades. I told him to give me a few days. He's been patient." After Peterson, she said there's a woman named Rodriguez who dairy farms out on the county line. Her milking system pump has been down for 10 days. They sat at the table for another hour working through what she knew and what she suspected and what Gerald had been hearing at the co-op, in the feed store, and by the time he left, they had a list with 9 names on it and a rough schedule for the coming week. Gerald tucked the notebook back in his shirt pocket and picked up his thermos and stood. "Howard would have liked this," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "All of it," Gerald said. "The whole thing. He'd have liked seeing it work the way he always said it would." She didn't answer right away. She stood at the screen door and watched him walk to his truck, and she thought about Howard at his workbench in the evenings, the lamp throwing yellow light across his hands and across the notebook open beside his tools, writing down his predictions in careful sentences while the Nebraska night settled in around the barn. She thought she was glad he had written them down. She thought she was glad she had kept writing after he stopped. Dale Peterson arrived at 9 on Wednesday morning with a list of what he needed and a look on his face that was somewhere between relief and embarrassment, the expression of a man who has been too proud to ask for help and has finally run out of alternatives. His disc harrow had thrown 2 blades and cracked the hub assembly on a 3rd disc. The dealer in Columbus had told him 6 weeks. His summer fieldwork was sitting idle. Eleanor led him to the section of the barn she thought of as the tillage row, the long south wall where Howard had organized the components of every groundworking implement he had ever acquired. She found the disc blades within 4 minutes. The hub assembly took a little longer. She had two that were close and one that was exact, pulled from a harrow she had bought at an estate sale in Cozad 3 years prior for $40. Peterson stood beside her as she worked and took in the barn with the slow recalibration of a man discovering that a place he thought he understood is something else entirely. "Lord," he said at one point, looking down the length of the main aisle. "How long has this been here?" "Most of it 40 years, Eleanor said. "Some of it longer. And you know where everything is?" "I know where most of it is," she said. Howard knew where all of it was. "I'm still learning some of his corners." Peterson shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in something closer to reverence. Before he left, Eleanor stopped him at the door. She had the second notebook open on Howard's workbench, the continuation, the one that was hers now as much as his. She told Peterson what she needed from him. He looked at the notebook, at the open page with its column headings written in her precise hand. Machine type, year, failure description, root cause if known, fix applied, notes for next time. "You want me to write down what broke," he said. "And how we fixed it," Eleanor said. "Everything you know about it. Even the parts that seem obvious, especially those." He sat on the stool and wrote for 10 minutes carefully, the way a man writes when he understands that what he's writing matters. When he finished, he handed the notebook back and looked at what he'd written. "My father used to keep records like this," he said. "I thought it was old-fashioned." Eleanor closed the notebook. "It is old-fashioned," she said. "That's not the same as wrong." Margaret Rodriguez arrived that same afternoon. She ran a dairy operation on the county line, 240 cows, a milking parlor that operated twice daily without exception because the cows do not observe supply chain disruptions. Her primary pump had failed 10 days ago, and she had been running a backup system that was itself aging and unreliable. If the backup failed, she would have no way to milk the herd. The consequences of that, in both animal welfare and financial terms, were severe enough that she had been sleeping in the barn on a cot for the past week, listening to the backup pump's irregular rhythm through the night. Eleanor did not have the exact pump. She told Margaret this plainly, without apology, when she finished examining what Margaret had described. She watched Margaret's face and saw the drop that happens when a person has been holding on to the last piece of hope they identified, and it turns out to be unavailable. "But," Eleanor said. Margaret looked up. Eleanor led her to a different section of the barn, one that she privately thought of as the dairy wall, though it was not labeled that way. Howard had never dairied himself, but he had acquired components from several dairy operations that had sold off or converted over the years, understanding that a mechanical principle is a mechanical principle, regardless of what it's attached to. She found a pump from a 1968 milking system. Different model, different configuration, but built around the same fundamental hydraulic principles as Margaret's failed unit. The fittings were a different standard. The flow rate was slightly lower, but the core mechanism was sound, and Eleanor's mind, trained by 40 years of working with Howard, and 8 years alone, was already moving through the modifications. "Give me this evening and tomorrow morning," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at the old pump. She was a practical woman, a woman who had been making do with what was available her entire farming life. "What are you going to do with it?" Eleanor picked up the pump and set it on the workbench. "I'm going to make it work," she said. She spent that evening in the shop Howard had built along the barn's north wall, a small, organized space with a metal lathe, a drill press, a welding setup, and every hand tool a machinist would need arranged on pegboard, with the outlines painted in so you could see at a glance what was missing. Howard had built the shop in 1969, and Eleanor had maintained it with the same discipline she maintained everything else. She machined new adapter fittings from bar stock. She modified the pump's mounting bracket. She tested the flow characteristics against her calculations and made 2 adjustments. She worked until past midnight and finished the remaining work before 7 the following morning. Margaret Rodriguez had her cows milked by 9:30 on June 9th. She sat in Eleanor's kitchen afterward and drank coffee and did not say much for a while, and then she said, "I don't know how to thank you." Eleanor told her about the notebook. Margaret wrote in it for nearly 20 minutes, a thorough account of everything she knew about her milking system's maintenance history, the failure mode. She had observed the symptoms she had dismissed too early. When she finished, she looked at the pages she'd filled and said, "I wish I'd written all of this down years ago." "Everyone does," Eleanor said. "Start now." By the end of the second week of June, Eleanor had helped 14 farms. Not all of them required the same depth of work as Peterson's harrow or Rodriguez's pump. Some were straightforward: a bearing here, a seal kit there, a belt that was the right dimension and the right construction, pulled from a bin and handed across a workbench in 10 minutes. But others required the same patient inventive problem solving that Eleanor had been practicing since she was a young woman sitting on an overturned bucket watching Howard work. She fabricated parts from raw stock when nothing else would fit. She modified components that were close but not exact using a machinist's judgment built from decades of practice. She adapted solutions from one mechanical context to another, finding the universal principle beneath the specific application. Gerald Paxton managed the schedule with quiet efficiency, keeping his list in the notebook he had brought that first Tuesday morning. He arranged the visits so that the most urgent cases came first. He fielded the phone calls that began coming in from neighboring counties as word spread through the agricultural networks that operated then, as now, largely through conversation and reputation. A reporter from the Lincoln Journal-Star appeared at Eleanor's farm on June 14th. He was a young man from Omaha who had driven 2 hours after receiving a tip from a contact in Harlan County who thought there might be a story worth telling. He spent 3 hours at the farm. He walked through the barn with Eleanor, who showed him the system and explained its history without embellishment or performance. He interviewed Gerald Paxton, who gave him the plain facts in plain sentences. He talked to Dale Peterson and Margaret Rodriguez and 2 other farmers who were willing to speak on the record about what the barn had meant to their operations in the past 2 weeks. The story ran in the Journal-Star on June 18th under the headline, "Widow's Barn Saves the Harvest." The reporter had written it well, letting the facts carry the weight without pressing them into shapes they didn't want to hold. It did not quote Eleanor at length. She had answered the reporter's questions honestly and without flourish, and he had recognized that her directness was more powerful than any elaboration would be. One line from his interview with her did appear in the story near the end. When he asked her whether she had anticipated that the barn would be needed in exactly this way, she had said Howard anticipated it. "I just kept his work going." The reporter had written that down and used it as written understanding that it was already exactly right. The 30-day deadline the county council had set for Eleanor Voss expired on a Monday. On that Monday morning, Ryan Caldwell drove to the Harlan County Courthouse. He was not carrying a manila folder. He was carrying a clipboard with a petition attached to it, and the petition had 147 signatures on it. Every farmer Eleanor had helped directly had signed it. Their neighbors had signed it. Townspeople who had read the Journal-Star story had signed it. Farmers from 2 neighboring counties who had driven to Route 9 during the strike and come away with parts they couldn't have found anywhere else had signed it. The petition was addressed to the Harlan County Council. It described the Voss farm property as a community agricultural resource of demonstrated and irreplaceable value. It requested that all outstanding complaints against the property be withdrawn. It requested that the council formally recognize the barn's contribution to the county's agricultural stability during the supply crisis. And it requested in plain language that Ryan had written himself and rewritten 3 times before he got it right, that an apology be entered into the public record on behalf of the council for the manner in which the original complaint had been presented. Ryan presented the petition at the regular council meeting that Monday evening. He stood at the podium where he had stood 6 weeks before with his photographs and his manila folder and his carefully prepared remarks. The room was more crowded this time. People were standing along the back wall. He did not prepare remarks this time. He spoke from the position he was actually in, which was the position of a man who had been wrong in public and had decided that the correction should also be public. He said that he had looked at Eleanor Voss's property from the outside and decided he understood it without investigating what it actually was. He said that this was a failure of both judgment and basic courtesy. He said that the phrase he had used at the previous meeting, he did not repeat it, but everyone in the room remembered it was wrong in a way that went beyond the factual error and into something that had no place in how this community talked about its members. He said that what Eleanor Voss had built on Route 9 was not a hoarding problem. It was 43 years of accumulated knowledge in physical form, maintained by a woman of unusual competence and foresight, and that it had saved the harvest for more than a dozen families in Harlan County during a crisis that no dealer and no modern supply system had been able to address. He said he was sorry. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something genuine has been said in a place where genuine things are not always said. Tom Briggs called the vote. It was unanimous. The complaint was withdrawn. The designation was approved. The apology was entered into the record. Eleanor was not at the meeting. She had known what Ryan was doing, and she had wished him well, and she had stayed home because she had never needed the county's recognition to know what the barn was, and the formal acknowledgement, while welcome, did not change anything essential. She was in the barn that evening, doing what she had always done, walking the rows, checking the inventory, making notes in the second notebook by the light that hung from the rafters on its long cable. A week after the council meeting, Ryan Caldwell came back to Route 9. He had been thinking since the day he had stood in the barn and seen it for what it was about a problem that he could not stop turning over in his mind. The problem was simple to state and difficult to solve. Eleanor Voss was 67 years old. She was healthy and sharp and entirely capable, and he hoped with a sincerity that surprised him in its intensity that she had many years ahead of her. But the knowledge that lived in this barn, the system, the cross-references, the 43 years of accumulated understanding of where everything was and why that knowledge existed primarily in Eleanor's mind. Howard's original system was a foundation. The handwritten labels were a guide. But the full map of the place, the complete understanding of what was here and how it connected to everything else that lived in Eleanor. When she was gone, it would go with her, unless someone did something about it. He sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had poured without asking whether he wanted one, and he laid out what he had been thinking. He wanted to catalog the barn, not just the existing labels and bins, but a full systematic inventory, every component documented, with its specifications, its source, its condition, its cross-references to the machines it could serve. He wanted it in a format that could be searched, that could be shared, that would exist independently of any single person's memory. He knew it would take a long time. He knew it would require Eleanor's knowledge and her patience and her willingness to spend hours explaining things to a man who was starting from behind. He was prepared for all of that. Eleanor listened to him the way she listened to everything without interrupting, without her expression giving him much to read. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That would take months, she said, probably longer. There are thousands of parts in there, I know, Ryan said, and you'd want to do this on top of running your own operation, on evenings, weekends, whenever I have time. He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. I owe you that, he said, at minimum, after what I did. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She set down her cup and stood from the table, and he thought she was about to answer him. Instead, she walked past him through the kitchen doorway and down the short hall and returned a minute later carrying something he hadn't seen before. It was a flat document box, the kind used for storing papers, dark green with a hinged lid. She set it on the table between them and opened it. Inside was a sheaf of papers, perhaps 20 or 30 pages held together with a binder clip. The pages were typewritten, not printed from a computer, but typed on an actual typewriter, the characters slightly uneven in the way of keys that had been used 10,000 times. The top page bore a date March 1983. Ryan looked at Eleanor. Howard started this 11 years ago, she said. She did not touch the papers, just looked at them. He wanted to create a record of everything in the barn, every part, every cross-reference, every application. He got about a third of the way through before he passed. Ryan reached out slowly and lifted the top page. It was a catalog entry, meticulous organized listing components with their specifications and origins and the machines they had come from. The handwriting on the margin notes was the same careful script he had seen on the original bin labels throughout the barn. He set the page down and looked at Eleanor. She reached into the document box and lifted the typed pages to one side, revealing what lay beneath them. A separate stack of papers, these ones handwritten rather than typed, filled with the small, precise cursive he recognized from the second notebook. The pages were dated beginning in the fall of 1986. She had continued it. Every year since Howard's death, she had added to what he started, pushing the catalog forward in her own hands section by section through the barn's inventory. He looked at the two stacks of papers side by side in the box. Howard's typed pages from 1983. Eleanor's handwritten continuation from 1986 to the present. 11 years of two people working on the same document, separated by death, but connected by purpose, the second voice picking up exactly where the first one stopped. He looked at the top of Howard's first typed page. There in the center, Howard had written a title for the document, "For Whoever Needs It Most." Ryan sat with that for a moment. The June evening was settling outside the kitchen window, the fields going quiet in the long Nebraska dusk. He thought about his father's tools sold at the estate sale in 1989, about the knowledge Frank Caldwell had carried that had gone with him because nobody had thought to write it down, about all the things that live inside a person and disappear when the person does not, because they weren't worth keeping, but because keeping things requires someone who understands their value early enough to act on it. Howard Voss had understood. He had started acting on it in 1983 quietly, without telling anyone, in the conviction that the work mattered, regardless of whether he lived to finish it. Eleanor had understood. She had picked up the pen in 1986 and kept going in the faith that the work he had started was worth completing, even if she never knew who would eventually use it. They had been building this for whoever came through the door, and now here he was. Eleanor closed the document box and looked at him steadily. "And I have a condition," she said. He waited. She went to the kitchen drawer where she kept the second notebook and came back with it open to the pages filled with the repair records of the past 2 weeks. Peterson's, Harrow Rodriguez's pump, every fix documented in the handwriting of the farmers who had sat on Howard's stool and written down what they knew. "Every person who comes to this barn for help writes in this book," she said. "That's already how it works. When you catalog the parts, I want the same principle. Every piece that goes into the database, you write down where it came from and what it was used for and what you learned from working with it. Not just the specifications. The story." Ryan looked at the notebook, at the pages dense with different handwritings, different hands having held the pen, different voices reduced to the same black ink on the same lined pages. "A machine is not just its specifications," Eleanor said. "It's everything that happened to it. Every field it worked in, every repair that kept it going another season. That's what makes the knowledge real. You can write down the part number all you like, but the part number without the story is just a number." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." He thought about his father's farm, about the tools he had sold at the estate sale, about the knowledge Frank Caldwell had carried in his hands and in his decisions, and in the way he looked at a broken machine and understood what it needed, about how none of that had been written down because Frank had not thought to write it down, or had thought there would be more time, or had simply not understood that the knowledge in a person is only safe while the person is there to hold it. "All right," Eleanor said, "bring your notebook Saturday morning and bring Derek. We'll start in the northeast corner and work our way through." The cataloging project took 3 years. Ryan and Derek came on Saturday mornings and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, and occasionally on Sunday afternoons when the weather kept them off the fields. Eleanor walked them through the barn section by section, explaining Howard's original system and the elaborations she had made, pulling components from shelves and bins and talking through their specifications and origins and applications, while one of the brothers wrote and the other photographed and asked questions. It was slow work. It was sometimes tedious work. There were Saturday mornings when Ryan drove out to Route 9 with his notebook and his camera, feeling the particular resistance that comes with any long project when the end is not yet visible. And he would walk through the barn door and Eleanor would already be there with coffee and something already pulled from a shelf that she thought he needed to understand that day, and the resistance would dissolve into the specific interest of a person learning something real. He learned more about agricultural mechanics in those 3 years than he had learned in the previous 20. Not from books or dealer seminars or equipment company training programs. From Eleanor, who had learned from Howard, who had learned from his father, who had learned from the machines themselves. He learned how to look at a failed component and read its failure, what the wear patterns meant, where the stress had concentrated, what the history of the machine's use was written in the damage. He learned how to cross-reference parts across manufacturers and model years, finding the equivalences that had no official documentation, but were real, nonetheless the connections that existed in the physical world, whether or not anyone had written them down. He learned that a part number is the beginning of knowledge, not the end of it. Derek turned out to have a particular gift for the database work. He had a methodical mind patient with detail in a way that complemented Ryan's broader orientation, and he designed the cross-referencing system that eventually allowed the completed archive to be searched by multiple pathways, by manufacturer, by model year, by part type, by application, and by the narrative records that Eleanor had insisted upon the stories that gave the numbers their context. By 1997, the database contained 47,000 individual entries. Eleanor Voss died in the spring of 2003 at the age of 76. She had been slowing down for 2 years, and in the last months, she had been more inside than out. More at Howard's old desk than in the barn, though she still went out most evenings to check the rows and make sure everything was as it should be. She had outlived Gerald Paxton and most of the neighbors of her generation, the people who had farmed this ground alongside her and Howard through the decades when the county looked like itself and not yet like something else. She left the farmhouse and the land to her daughter in Omaha, who had never farmed and did not intend to. She left the barn, the notebooks, the document box, and the database to Ryan Caldwell. The transfer had been her idea. She had called Ryan in the winter of 2002 and told him plainly what she intended, giving him no opportunity to protest because she had made her decision with the same certainty she brought to everything, and she did not need him to affirm it. "I'm not leaving it to you because you deserve it," she said with the directness that had always been her natural mode of communication. "I'm leaving it to you because you understand it now, and because you'll do right by it." He had not said anything for a moment. Then he had said, "I'll try." "That's all anyone can do," Eleanor said. The barn is still on Route 9. Ryan's son manages it now, a young man who grew up driving out there on Saturday mornings with his father, and who can walk the main aisle with his eyes closed and tell you what is on any shelf by memory, the way Eleanor could, the way Howard could before her. The database has been updated and expanded over the years, moving through successive generations of technology from the original computer files Ryan and Derek assembled in the mid-90s to the searchable online archive it became in the early 2000s. Farmers from 6 states have used it to find components that no dealer could source. Agricultural historians have cited it. 2 universities have sent researchers to study the organization system and write about what it represents. They call it the Voss Archive. The name was Ryan's idea. Eleanor had suggested they call it the Harlan County Agricultural Parts Registry, which was accurate and completely without poetry, and Ryan had said that with respect, he thought the name should reflect the people who built it, not the county that had once tried to shut it down. Eleanor had considered this and said, "All right," and that had been the end of the discussion. On the wall of the barn, just inside the main door, there is a framed photograph. It is the one from the Lincoln Journal Star story behind glass, now a little yellowed at the edges but still clear. It shows Eleanor Voss standing in front of the central shelving section, surrounded by the rows and bins and tagged components of 43 years of accumulated knowledge, looking at the camera with an expression that is not quite a smile, but contains everything a smile contains. Below the photograph on a piece of barn board that Ryan planed smooth and lettered himself one winter evening, there is a plaque. It reads, "Parts are money, every bolt, every bearing, every gear. That's money you won't have to spend later. Keep everything. Fix what you can. Someday you'll be glad you did. Howard Voss, 1952. And below that, in smaller letters added by Ryan's son when he took over management of the barn, she kept his word. Eleanor Voss, 1986 to 2003. Here is what the story of Eleanor Voss is really about. It is not about a barn full of old parts, though the barn is where everything happened. It is not about a trucking strike, though the strike was the moment when everything hidden became visible. It is not even about the humiliation at the county meeting and the reckoning that followed, though that is the shape the story takes when you tell it from the outside. It is about the difference between seeing and understanding. Ryan Caldwell saw the barn from a truck window and made a decision. He gathered evidence for the decision he had already made, and he presented it confidently to a room full of people who were prepared to agree with him, and they agreed with him, and for a short time that felt like being right. Eleanor Voss understood the barn from the inside out, from decades of living in it and learning from it and continuing the work of a person she had loved, who had seen something true about the world and spent his life acting on it. The barn did not change between those two perspectives. What changed was the angle. And what changed the angle was not argument or confrontation or public vindication, though all of those things eventually arrived. What changed the angle was a seized bearing in a feeder house on June 3rd of 1994, which brought a man who had been looking from the outside to a door he had never walked through. That is how the truth usually works. It does not announce itself. It does not defend itself. It waits. It does its work in the dark, in the evenings, in the patient hours that other people spend on other things, and it accumulates the way parts accumulate on shelves, steadily, methodically, without drama, in the faith that the day will come when everything stored up will be exactly what is needed. Howard Voss understood that. He wrote it down in a brown leather notebook in 1981 and put it in a desk drawer and kept building the thing he believed in. Eleanor understood it. She found the notebook and read it and picked up where he left off and kept going for 17 more years in the dark in the evenings for whoever needed it most. And somewhere in a barn on a county road in Nebraska, 47,000 parts sit on their labeled shelves in the yellow light, waiting.